Greetings everyone! In this lecture, I want to review the arc that led from the post-colonial hopes for health rights universalization after imperialism to the sorts of exclusionary and selective health programming that has evolved in the period from the 1980s to today. You can think of this as a countervailing, restrictive and rationing arc that has tended to cross and curtail the arc moving towards health justice described in the movie Bending the Arc. Driven by the debt crises of the 1980s, this countervailing arc instead bends towards selectivity in programming. It is crucial to understand in order to appreciate why it has been so hard for organizations like Partners in Health to bend the arc of global health back towards universality. We need to remember in this regard that instead of the racist double standards of colonial health, which tended to privilege the health of white armies and administrations over local people, newly independent post-colonial states envisioned much more universalistic health services that would ultimately enable them to achieve health for all their people. It was this post-imperial vision that was collectively articulated at the World Health Organization Conference of Alma-Ata in 1978, leading to the famous Declaration of Alma-Ata, in which health for all by the year 2000 was the major central goal. But it was in turn this same universalistic vision that was subsequently thwarted by the debt crises of the 1980s and 1990s, and the austerity and other forms of structural adjustment that then followed, leading to much more exclusionary and selective approaches to global health ever since. So the plan for this lecture involves 3 key steps. First, I will review the Alma-Ata conference, including the universalistic post-colonial impulse at the heart of the Declaration of Alma-Ata. Second, I will detail the chain of events that led into and out of the 1980s debt crisis, events which ended up with the World Bank and IMF imposing deep and enduring cuts on spending in healthcare, education, and housing. This forced austerity in much of the global South during the 1980s that continued into the 1990s intersected with the AIDS epidemic. It created a kind of perfect storm for African, Latin American, and Asian countries that were left unable to handle the epidemic of AIDS and other health problems because they didn't have functioning health systems. Then, third, I will conclude the story in this lecture by highlighting how the universalistic vision of Alma-Ata in 1978 also faced an ideational obstacle too, in the form of much more selective approaches to deploying low-cost but limited interventions that were seen as more realistic in the context of neoliberal austerity. These targeted and selective approaches are what eventually led to a series of attempts, including the Global Fund itself, but also the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS relief tied to the new Washington Consensus that I've already described. While these efforts have certainly sought to compensate for the damage done by the old Washington Consensus of the 1980s and 1990s, they've continued to curtail the broader vision of health for all that was articulated at Alma-Ata. Far from building back towards the universalistic primary healthcare plans made in 1978, these new approaches have been much more selective, often involving the importation of Western biomedical expertise to try to address the diseases, rather than to build up primary healthcare systems that are locally owned and operated. This foreign aid still remains a far cry from the racist double standards of colonial health and tropical medicine, but its selectivity has failed to honor the promise of health for all made by post-colonial states in Alma-Ata. I want to set the scene, first of all, by quickly reviewing how the end of empire led into what happened in 1978 in Alma-Ata. There had been a big conference in 1937 before World War II in Java, where, as Randall Packard underlines, horizontal health systems development was seen as an urgent priority coming out of colonialism. More generally, as independence movements started to win freedom from imperialism during the 1940s and after World War II, there was a widespread appreciation that decolonization demanded real health equity and an end of the white supremacist double standards of colonialism. When it was founded in 1946, the World Health Organization also articulated these decolonizing aspirations, with the hopes and dreams coming out of World War II for health in peacetime being much more than just the absence of disease. The World Health Organization instead saw health as involving the complete physical, mental, and social well-being of whole populations, and not just a matter of individuals fighting individual diseases one after another on their own. Another enabling set of ideas articulated during the 1960s going into Al-Matar was for a new international economic order, or NEIO. Articulated most strongly by the so-called non-aligned movement, it came with high hopes in big new democracies in the global south, countries like Indonesia and India, that we could escape the divisions of the Cold War and free the world of the problems produced by Soviet and Western interests constantly fighting over the global south. Instead, they argued, the global south could remain non-aligned and be part of a new international economic order that was neither socialist in the Russian sense nor capitalist in the American sense. That at least was the kind of hope that also animated the spirit of the Alma-Ata conference. The result was a phenomenally inclusive global conference that featured 3,000 delegates coming together in Alma-Ata, or what's now known as Almaty in Kazakhstan. At the time, it was still part of the USSR, and from a lot of the photographs that we have from Alma-Ata, you get the strong Soviet vibe with massive halls and a big meeting venue that was quite well provided for infrastructurally. It looks like a developed country context, and in fact the Soviets were very keen to impress the world at Alma-Ata with their great hospital system and their biomedical investments in health as big achievements of Soviet socialism. But that wasn't the common emphasis of everybody else coming to the conference. Among most of the delegates from the Global South, as well as with leaders from the World Health Organization, there was much more interest in primary healthcare, not fancy hospitals and fancy conference halls. And the common thread through all the contributions and arguments of the post-colonial countries that came to the conference was that health was a fundamental human right, that inequalities in health associated with empire were unacceptable, that a new international economic order was vital. Governments, they concurred, had a responsibility for the health of their people. Reciprocally, they insisted that people have a right to participate in planning their healthcare. No more double standards, no more colonial administrators telling people who got access to the health center and who did not. Another big theme of the conference was that universal primary healthcare must be integral to health systems and accessible universally, administered locally as close to the people in need as possible. This kind of primary healthcare, delegates agreed, must be tailored for local needs, and it should include education and prevention as well as biomedical curative treatment. All governments, they insisted, should plan, partner and cooperate to working towards making health for all a reality. This was the big takeaway from the conference. Underpinning it were hopes for a big global peace dividend tied to global disarmament and détente. In 1978, the Cold War was, well, you can't say cooling down, but it wasn't warming up anymore. And the hope in both Washington and in Moscow was that détente would lead to more money for things like health. Coming into Alma-Ata, there were also individuals that made a difference. Not least of all, there was Halfdan Mahler, the Danish physician serving as the Director General of the World Health Organization. He was a very influential figure, not least of all because he was a very passionate advocate of primary healthcare and of locally tailored healthcare that would actually address the needs of local people in the communities where they lived. As WHO director, he set the tone for Alma-Ata. The Soviets, as I said, were trying to showcase their high-tech hospitals and their commitment to government provisioning. But it was really the tone set by Haftar Mala and the non-aligned countries, including China at the time, but also Costa Rica, Mozambique, and Tanzania, that was more influential. All these countries were experimenting with universal primary health care, providing care workers, community health workers, and what the Chinese called barefoot doctors that reached out to local communities and didn't rely on a big hospital system. They focused more on providing preventative care to people close to where they lived. All of this was combined at Alma-Ata with the USA's own willingness to contribute to consensus talk about governments being responsible for universal primary health care. Now this was unusual, of course, because here in the US we have never had universal healthcare systems like the Europeans. We all continue to have to deal with health insurance and private healthcare providers and for-profit hospitals into the present. But with President Carter in the White House at the time of Alma-Ata in 1978, the US was much more aligned with the universalistic spirit of Alma-Ata. Under his leadership, the American representatives also had hopes about peace building and a peace dividend, leading to some kind of new economic opportunities around the world. So, what was actually declared based on all these consensus influences at the conference? The actual declaration took the form of this 10-point list of 10 declarative components, with the 11th point being simply the declaration of the goal of achieving health for all by the year 2000. The list is also in our textbook, in an appendix at the end, where you can see that each of the key 10 components has more detail than I am including here. Still, to help you remember the main features of the 10-point vision, here is my summary of the list. In short, the delegates declared that 1. Health, including social well-being, is fundamental and a fundamental human right. 2. Health inequality is politically, socially, and economically unacceptable. 3. Development with a new international economic order is key to the attainment of health for all. 4. Governments have a responsibility for the health of their people. 5. People have a right to participate in the planning of their own healthcare. 6. Primary healthcare is essential healthcare based on practical, scientifically sound methods. 7. Primary healthcare addresses the main health problems in the community, providing promotive, preventative, curative, and rehabilitative services accordingly. 8. All governments should develop policies to launch and sustain primary healthcare. 9. All countries should cooperate in a spirit of partnership to ensure primary healthcare for all. And 10. An acceptable level of health for all the people of the world by the year 2000 can be attained through a fuller and better use of the world's resources instead of military spending and war. If you go online and type in Alma-Ata Declaration, you can actually find all sorts of cheat sheets of the kind that I'm presenting here. They all also tend to underline that the declaration was the high watermark of universalistic commitments to public health. It was a huge accomplishment. But what everybody also has to confront is that the world as a whole has subsequently failed to live up to the promises made at Alma-Ata. So why was that? Why did the vision never become a reality? Historians like Randall Packard tend to put some of the blame on the actual planning at the conference. they say that it lacked a plan for global implementation. It was too abstract and it was too idealistic. In response, I think leaders such as Haftan Mahler might say that the declaration was based on all these things coming together, including that a new international economic order and détente would create a peace dividend that would allow countries to invest in health for all, and that this would be cheap because it wouldn't be based on big hospital systems and training tons of doctors, but instead be based on universal primary health care and commitments to training community health workers and barefoot doctors. So it would be more affordable for countries, they would argue. In other words, the pushback would be that it wasn't idealistic and abstract, it was very down to earth in every single sense. And also, for the same reason, it was also brought down to earth by real-world events. You see, in any case, whether or not the historians and participants might diverge on the conference itself, what really undermined Alma-Atar's promise was what happened afterwards. It was the political economic developments that followed in the 1980s that made the realization of the vision of Alma-Atar impossible. This is the big picture, not the lack of planning at the conference. After all, it was just a conference, not a planning agency or global government that Alma-Atar was representing. The fact is that the plans and hopes for health for all were crushed by the debt crises of the 1980s. These led to the World Bank and IMF Washington Consensus directives to liberalize, privatize, and stabilize, forcing neoliberal planning and austerity on poor countries with the hope that building wealth would lead to health. And this didn't happen. To understand why, we need to examine a lot of political economic history very quickly. So hold on tight while I rush here through a very compressed review of this economic roller coaster ride. You have to understand that the way the world economy was developing through the 60s and 70s involved increasing integration of the global economy. Countries came out of World War II and survived through the Cold War in ways that were still overshadowed by fears of a return of the depression, unemployment, and ultra-inflation that had originally led to the rise of authoritarian fascists such as Hitler and Mussolini. Instead of the autarky, the separation of national economies out of the international trading system that characterized the years leading up to World War II, American leaders sought to build a post-war international economy that was much more integrated. This led them to treat the former enemies from the war, Germany and Japan most especially, as important sites of post-war investment. The Marshall Plan for Europe and the US role in Japan led to huge investments of American capital. This was also seen by American policymakers as a way of forestalling the spread of communism. Instead, the hope was that it would expand the markets for American goods overseas. At the end of World War II, the US was the world's biggest economy, the richest country by far. So the US was in a commanding position to set the post-World War order. And it really did a lot to support Germany and Japan. But by the time we get to the 1960s, the German and Japanese economies are back up on their feet and starting to go gangbusters. And they're starting to compete with their exports for markets that the US was trying to sell into as well. So too were other economies in Europe coming back, like France and the UK, and increasing their exports too. And they were all trying to sell their products into the US market, as well as other foreign markets. So as a result, US industry started to lose its competitive edge to these cheaper foreign imports. At the same time, in the mid to late 1960s, the US was plunged into debt to pay for the Vietnam War overseas and a whole bunch of other investments related to that, including in Korea. Combined with domestic costs of the Great Society programs, the US therefore started to lose its economic capacity to fund the whole dollar-based system in the late 60s. This led to a strain on a peg between the value of the dollar and gold that had been set at Bretton Woods in a conference at the end of World War II. the US didn't have enough gold to back up all the dollars that were in global circulation. And so it started to print dollars to pay for everything. As a result, the actual value of the dollar was going down vis-a-vis gold. This was a problem because the US had committed to keep the value of the dollar at the same level as with gold that was set back in 1945. Eventually, President Nixon acknowledged the reality in 1971, and he closed the so-called dollar-gold window at the US Treasury. Foreigners holding dollars, all of the countries that were making profits by selling stuff to Americans and getting paid in dollars, could no longer go to the US and say, can we change those dollars for gold? Many complained, including the French, whose representative talked about America's exorbitant privilege. Its privilege to trade and borrow in its own currency, in other words. And this privilege was famously or infamously affirmed by the Texan Treasury Secretary for Nixon called John Connally, who summed up the relationship, no doubt with a good Texan accent, in the following terms. It's our currency and it's your problem, or something like that. He was right, because it really was everyone's problem. But it also became a US problem too. Through the 70s, when the country faced so-called stagflation, it faced a crippling mix of economic stagnation and inflation tied to currency devaluation, making important things like oil much more expensive. This ended up with Jimmy Carter getting voted out of office and Ronald Reagan coming in. But before he left office, Carter appointed a hawk to the Federal Reserve. His name was Paul Volcker, and he was determined to end inflation by hiking US interest rates. This is what then set off a huge shock to the global economy in the early 1980s, catalyzing the debt crises for poor countries in the global south. To pay for the rising costs of the 1970s, they had taken out loans from the US banks based in London. These were so-called euro-dollar loans because they were in US dollars but made out of Europe from London by US banks like Citibank and JP Morgan. When Volcker raised US interest rates, it did cure US inflation by pushing up the value of the dollar and slowing down the US economy. But it also simultaneously raised the interest rates on all these euro-dollar loans to global south countries that were then faced with a sort of double whammy. Their debts were actually becoming more expensive in dollar terms because the dollar was gaining in value against other currencies, including their own currencies. So they were hit by that. And they were also hit by the interest rates going up on the debts. The euro-dollar debt loan rates, the interest rates were going up in parallel with the US interest rates. Meanwhile, the global demand for their exports was tanking because the global economy was slumping because of the higher interest rates. This perfect storm is what led to the debt crises of the 1980s. What happened next is very effectively described by the movie Life and Debt, which you're watching this week. This movie documents the impact of the debt crises in Jamaica. It reminds us of how all the dreams of newly independent post-colonial countries for controlling their own development and destiny were suddenly overtaken by economic events. To deal with the debt problems, they had to turn to the IMF, World Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank. These Washington-based institutions in turn worked to reschedule the debts, effectively buying out the private bank lenders and allowing the countries like Jamaica to pay back the debts on a new schedule. They still owed the debts, but they could pay them back on a longer-term schedule. But in return, they demanded, the banks based in DC, demanded all the policy conditionalities of structural adjustment and neoliberal austerity. As the movie Life and Debt makes so brutally clear, the results were devastating. Countries like Jamaica effectively lost their post-colonial independence and sovereignty. Instead of the Queen of England, they were now ruled by IMF bureaucrats dictating harsh forms of economic reform. And the upshot was that the pledges of investing in things like universal primary healthcare went by the wayside. As this forced neoliberalization happened in poor countries around the world in the 80s and 90s, the plans for health for all that had been made at Alma-Ata really did become unrealistic. Governments simply had no capacity to take responsibility for the health of their populations, and meanwhile all sorts of allied investments in education and housing and infrastructure were also undermined in the interests of just paying off debts and complying with Washington Consensus conditionalities. Let me conclude here with one other important ideational aspect of the arc bending away from universalistic primary healthcare and the vision of health for all. It was definitely the material economic aspects of the 80s debt crises that created the biggest obstacles. But there were also competing ideas at work as well. Right after Alma-Ata in 1979, the Rockefeller Foundation sponsored a health and population development conference in Italy at their beautiful Bellagio Conference Center. The declared purpose of this conference was to specify effective strategies for implementing primary healthcare. But what they actually came up with was a much more narrowed and targeted plan for so-called selective primary healthcare. As opposed to the universalistic PHC of the Alma-Ata Declaration, SPHC was presented as a targeted way of obtaining low-cost solutions to very specific and common causes of death. The targets of selective PHC were supposed to be clear, concise, and measurable. Initially, as we will review in the next lecture, they were known as GOBI, growth monitoring, oral rehydration treatment, breastfeeding, and immunization. These were seen as the low-hanging fruit for selective primary healthcare. And later, it became GOBI FFF, adding food supplementation, female literacy, and family planning. But the larger point I want to underline here in conclusion is that selective primary healthcare really set the pattern for all the subsequent schemes for selectivity in global health programming that have followed ever since, ultimately leading into disease-specific selective programs and agencies like the Global Fund. This is how the arc from Alma-Ata universality has been bent towards selectivity. Combined with the material economic conditions I've summarized in today's lecture, the promise of universal primary healthcare has been put on hold ever since. And as our textbook underlines, this creates a whole series of countervailing forces that makes bending the arc towards health justice so much more difficult. So thanks for keeping track here to the end of this arc. Greetings folks and welcome back to GCH186. This is a lecture 2.2 on selectivity after Alma-Ata. I previously reviewed the aftermath of Alma-Ata and how many of the plans made there were effectively blocked by the debt crises of the 1980s. Today though, we still need to ask, what is the legacy? What remains the legacy of Alma-Ata after all these years? Alma-Ata itself is no longer called Alma-Ata. It's a city known as Almaty today, and it's in Kazakhstan, not the USSR. And even close by Almaty, in neighboring Tajikistan, Health for all remains a distant dream. Recent articles and books, including by Paul Farmer's colleagues, this guy Salman Khashoggi, in his book Blind Spot, have reported that neoliberal norms have become much more dominant in how health programming is organized in Tajikistan. His book details with an anthropologist's eye how in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, places like Tajikistan suddenly saw patients deprived of universal primary healthcare and cheap, affordable medicines. Instead, they had to face user fees and expensive medicines. They were reduced to accessing health services through charity and through humanitarian interventions from overseas groups, including the one that Khashoggi was working for himself. And all this is in a place just across the border from where the great pledges for health for all were made back in 1978 at Alma-Ata. Blind Spot serves in this way as a kind of representative for what happened to the legacy of Alma-Ata more generally. But that said, I don't want to suggest to you that Alma-Ata is completely dead and gone. It remains an inspiration in global health policy making, and not least of all, it remains an inspiration for the World Health Organization. So if you look at something like the 2008 Commission on the Social Determinants of Health report, which was done for the WHO, it's entitled Closing the Gap in a Generation. You see how it's really animated by the same concerns and approaches that animated Alma-Ata. There's an awareness that structural drivers and economic conditions in the international economic order strongly conditionalize and constrain access to universal primary healthcare. The WHO is all too aware that these structural drivers operate within countries under the authority of governments, but also increasingly over the last century and a half, they operate between countries under the effects of neoliberalized globalization. In other words, the structural drivers they refer to in the WHO report are basically composed of the 10 neoliberal policy commandments that I've already introduced. This toxic combination of bad policies, they argue, is in large measure responsible for the fact that a majority of people in the world do not enjoy the good health that is biologically possible. In other words, they've been reduced to biological sub-citizenship and not enfranchised as choice-making investors in their own health as imagined by the likes of Nicholas Rose, who you might remember talked about biological citizenship. Instead, they've been disenfranchised of health rights. Paul Farmer, of course, testifies to these disenfranchisement effects graphically in his work, including in his 2004 essay, which I totally recommend, on suffering and structural violence. He argues in this article that, quote, the emergence and persistence of AIDS and TB and other health problems in Haiti is rooted in the enduring effects of European expansion in the New World and in the slavery and racism with which it was associated. But, he goes on, neoliberalism is the ideology promoted by the victors of the struggles mentioned above. The dominance of a competition-driven market is said to be at the heart of this model, but in truth, this ideology is indebted to and helps to replicate inequalities of power. It is an ideology that has little to say about the economic and social inequalities that distort real economies, and instead reveals yet another means by which these economies can be further exploited. Close quote. I would submit that whether it's with Paul Farmer's witnessing of health problems in countries like Haiti or with the World Health Organization's indictment of the structural drivers of ill health in 2008, we see the spirit of Alma-Ata living on. But what has happened to global health programming itself represents a more complicated story. It's a story that I've already anticipated by talking about the arc trending from universality in 1978 towards selectivity in the years that followed. In this way, we see primary healthcare failing to take off due to debt and structural adjustment programs, which brought the neoliberal conditionalities imposed by the Washington Consensus institutions, the IMF and the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank. Together, they imposed harsh austerity on countries in return for debt rescheduling, and this led to a lack of adequate political and resource commitments for health in particular. Now, other scholars, like Randall Packard, have highlighted that other problems got in the way of implementing primary health care as well, including, not least of all, the lack of adequate implementation guidelines coming out of Alma-Ata. In addition, in country after country, there were limited resources and there were also conflicts over resource allocation between tertiary and primary care, between private and public sectors, between the urban and the rural, between favoured regions and less favoured regions, between doctors and nurses, and so on and so forth. Now, these conflicts were worsened during the Cold War and during the 80s and 90s amid the debt crises by a confluence of geopolitical influences and interests that led to American and Western support for dictators and Soviet support for dictators in a whole variety of countries, including the Philippines, Zaire, Chile, Brazil, Argentina, and right across Central America. These corrupt dictatorial regimes were very bad at delivering on any kind of health commitments at all. And all these influences inhibited the takeoff of universal primary health care. In addition, as I indicated at the close of the last lecture, we also see the influence of selective primary health care as an ideational influence on global health programming. With the Bellagio Conference in 1979, UNICEF, the United Nations International Emergency Fund for Children, launched the GOBI initiative, and USAID launched its parallel child survival program. And both these initiatives took programming for health towards more selectivity and away from universal primary health care. You see this also being advocated by World Bank reports like the one entitled Adjustment with a Human Face. And there were many other reports and advocacy articles recommending the move towards selectivity. One of these was published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Julia Walsh and Kenneth Warren. You can see the front page of it here in the abstract, and that abstract points to priority setting as the big recommendation. They effectively argue for a rationing approach because, they say, there were not enough resources. This then became the overarching background rationale for selective primary health care. Universal primary health care is great, they all said, but we simply can't afford it. This argument then got more traction as the 1980s debt crises rolled on. Primary health care, they all argued at the time, required political will that was also diminished because of all the corrupt regimes. And it also needed immense organizational support of the kind that was anticipated at Alma-Ata, but which was in short supply in the debt crisis years, as government after government lost authority, lost sovereignty due to structural adjustment through the 80s and 90s. By the way, structural adjustment got renamed and rebranded in the 1990s, and instead of SAPs or SAPs, the World Bank and IMF asked countries to write their own poverty reduction strategy papers, as they were called, or PRSPs. These PRSPs were basically just SAPs that countries were obliged to write for themselves, accepting austerity as a condition for getting loan rescheduling. On top of all this, there was an ideological element to the Walsh and Warren article, and to other like-minded articles. It was an economistic and rationing ideology of cost-effectiveness. It was all about establishing priorities and making the case that you can't do everything at once. It was really interested in quick fixes and short-term goals and a quick return on an investment. But as a result, it put off long-term investments in universal health system delivery. This set of ideas remains an important influence on global fund funding, and we'll come back to that at the end of this lecture. It also comes with an ideology of trusting in the power of technology and technical fixes to address broader social and economic problems, rather than pursuing more radical social and economic reforms. It wasn't ill-intended, it was largely meant well, and the advocates of it really did think it was the best option given the limited circumstances. People like Jim Grant from UNICEF were true believers in their approach, and they really thought it was the best option under the constrained economic circumstances. It was Grant who influenced the move to selective primary healthcare that was planned at the Rockefeller-sponsored workshops at Bellagio, where it also received USAID support and World Bank support, as well as growing support from some WHO representatives. Because of Grant's emphasis on measuring the results of selective investments and in tailoring programming in this very targeted, disease-specific way, he continues to be hailed by the likes of Bill Gates as a leader in global health. As a result of all these influences, selective programs gained ascendancy together. The selective primary healthcare vision articulated by Walsh and Warren, the UNICEF GOBI plan for growth monitoring, oral rehydration therapy, breastfeeding and immunizations, to which were later added family planning, female literacy and food, those 3 Fs. And then later, USAID rolled out pretty much the same vision in the form of an initiative called Child Survival. The underlying rationales are by now all fairly familiar. They argued that it was an application of appropriate technologies, nothing fancy, nothing too expensive. It involved a faith in the capacity of vaccines and things like oral rehydration therapy to make a big difference by stopping disease and stopping vulnerability in children's early years, thereby getting a lot of long-term health bang for the buck by saving lives early on. There was far less faith in building health systems and organizational government structures to cope with disease and to do prevention over the long haul. You can tell by now that there were a series of ideological shifts that came with the ideational emphasis on selectivity and rationing. The new programs were much more verticalized and targeted at individual diseases and individual isolated problems. There was therefore an ideological shift from a vision of public responsibility at Alma-Ata to a much more focused emphasis on individual responsibility, because individuals were seen to be able to use techniques like growth monitoring and breastfeeding and so forth. This focus on the individual was a distinctly neoliberal move, of course, because it also took the emphasis off government health services while also raising concerns with the limitations of government bureaucracies to do all the monitoring. Another ideological tilt associated with neoliberal skepticism about state planning reimagined the challenge of resource allocation in terms of resource scarcity. Partners in Health even has a word for this, namely TBMI, which stands critically for Transnational Bureaucrats Managing Inequality, TBMI. It's a kind of cool acronym, but it testifies to an uncool problem, that management of resource scarcity became the kind of business code of global health programming. Back in the context of 1978, in the days of hope for universal primary healthcare, there was a sense that education or health spending was an alternative to military spending. With the shift to vertical programming, the emphasis was all about cost effectiveness. It's no longer about saying which sector matters more to us on a moral or political basis, but simply, how can we get the biggest health bang for the buck, given that we've got limited bucks available? Instead of comprehensive and integrated interventions, there was also much more of a focus on narrowly defined and prioritized disease control. Particular diseases were isolated and seen as low-hanging fruit for investment. And this is what then led to the focus on the big 3 diseases by the likes of the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. Instead of broad-ranging interventions, you get interventions that are seen as having low recurrent costs. And instead of focusing on health systems, you have a focus on very targeted and localized, often territorially localized interventions, not whole country interventions. Structurally and organizationally, the selective approach looks totally different to the former primary healthcare vision. That latter had a hierarchical arrangement within countries, with ministries of health in charge of running a country's whole health system, with a series of provincial hospitals, district health centres and health posts going down to community health workers and trained birthing attendants, all of them working out in the field and with cold chain referral centres and prescriptions for common diseases and health education, all being coordinated at a country level by the Ministry of Health. By contrast with child survival, GOBI, and UNICEF projects, there was much more of a fragmented system, which was much more vertically, less horizontally organized. As a result, donors from far away, from overseas, often overstepped the Ministry of Health to fund international NGOs in a country and did not really work with the MOH consistently to organize programming. The legacy is a style of approach focusing much more on particular diseases in particular communities, using community health workers only sometimes, and coordinating vaccination programs and their mobile units and cold chains sometimes with the MOH, but oftentimes in more fragmented and vertically organized systems. The MOH often ends up getting sidelined as a result. People did see and continue to see the limitations of this approach. This cartoon captures an obvious sort of awareness of the limitation of only focusing on things like oral rehydration therapy, or ORS, standing for oral rehydration salts. The little girl is saying, wouldn't it make more sense to build a bridge to help the children cross this chasm beneath which you see measles and diarrhea and malnutrition laying in wait? But instead of building a bridge, we have this sort of patchy approach of delivering oral rehydration packages. Now, countries themselves wanted bridges, just like the little girl was saying. For example, Cambodia had an agenda for health, and its Ministry of Health had an agenda for what were the priorities for health, starting with primary healthcare coverage, followed by scaling up equity funds and contracting in remote areas. But when you go to look at what the vertical programs were that were actually funded in the country by outside authorities, you see suddenly this verticalized focus on HIV and the control of infectious diseases. Broader health system support was thereby pushed down the list of priorities. Over time, this has happened repeatedly in country after country, with more and more vertical initiatives following the other, almost as a sort of trendy programming evolution. Child survival came out of '79 and only lasted a while. In 1983, vitamin A suddenly became trendy. Then in 1986, maternal mortality became a focus, with an emphasis on trained birthing attendants. In 1986, acute lower respiratory diseases were also suddenly a favored target of intervention. And then as the AIDS crisis took off, it became a core focus. It was later eclipsed by rollback malaria in 1999, and in 2002 we see the Global Fund take off with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and with its own narrowed focus on just AIDS, TB and malaria. Laurie Garrett, one of our own UCSC alums, who's gone on to become a global health journalist and policy advisor, has really called out the problem in all this global health targeting. In 2007, she wrote a great piece that I'm going to quote twice from here and highlighted in it the narrowing focus on targets and the problem that came with this targeting. Thanks to philanthropic efforts, she said, there are now billions of dollars being made available for health spending and thousands of NGOs and humanitarian groups vying to spend it. But much more money is required. It takes states and healthcare systems and at least passable local infrastructure to improve public health in a developing world. And because of decades of neglect, there have rendered local hospitals, clinics and laboratories and medical schools and health talent dangerously deficient, much of the cash now flooding the field is leaking away without result. Moreover, she went on, In all too many cases, aid is tied to short-term numerical targets, such as increasing the number of people receiving specific drugs, decreasing the number of pregnant women diagnosed with HIV, or increasing the quantity of bed nets handed out to children to block disease-carrying mosquitoes. Few donors seem to understand that it will take at least a full generation to substantially improve public health, and the effort should focus less on particular diseases than on broad measures that affect populations' general well-being." Close quote. Now, this is a real condemnation of selectivity and the associated turning away from health systems funding towards targeted interventions, and it's being made by a UCSC biology BS alum. Now, she continued by arguing that legislatures in the major donor nations should consider how the current targeting requirements they place on their funding may have adverse outcomes. For example, the US Congress and its counterparts in Europe and Canada have mandated HIV/AIDS programs that set specific targets for the number of people who should receive ARVs, or are placed in orphan care centers, obtain condoms, and the like. If these targets, she goes on, are achievable only by robbing local healthcare workers from pediatric and general health programs, they may well do more harm than good and should be changed or eliminated. Close quote. Now, Garrett usefully highlights in these ways the direct downside of health systems weakening as a result of this focus on selectivity. And as I have been saying here, this selectivity really goes back to the vision of selective primary healthcare that was made at Bellagio in 1979. Today, it continues into the targeted approach of the Global Fund. The fund can claim many beneficial results, and the number of lives saved continues to grow over time. The fund uses funds as cost effectively as it can to narrowly target AIDS, TB, and malaria, and this has made it easy to go back to donor governments and their populations arguing for replenishment funding. It seems like the money's being well spent because it's not sort of being frittered away on bureaucracy. It's going directly towards these 3 individual diseases. It makes it an easier ask. In these ways, selective primary healthcare continues to animate thinking around the Global Fund. Nevertheless, the Global Fund has become quite a complex bureaucracy of its own, and in part that relates to its results-based financing approach, which you can definitely trace back to UNICEF and Bellagio. But at the same time, the focus on results has created increasing awareness over time at the Global Fund of the need to invest in health system strengthening. So as you start to navigate the Global Fund website resources, bear in mind that it's been navigating this ongoing tension between the disease-specific targeted approach and the needs of sustaining and expanding health systems and who benefits from the interventions through forms of health system strengthening. To do this work, you need to learn a little bit about the Global Fund's own in-house jargon. Remember, it's a global fund and that it works through the principles of fund management. Remember that this brings with it a focus on financialized accountability through performance-based funding, or PBF. This performance-based funding is in turn coordinated through country coordinating mechanisms, or CCMs, that are designed to transcend state-society divides and deal with the problems of state corruption. To some extent, it's also monitored carefully for more accountability through technical review panels in Geneva that are always evaluating what the CCMs from particular countries propose. So when you propose your own mock proposal to the fund, you are basically emulating what a CCM does, and your primary audience is going to be a technical review panel in Geneva. When this technical review panel releases funds, it releases them to principal recipients that may be government finance departments, or maybe the ministries of health, or it may even be an independent agency in a receiving country. When the fund does actually turn to address health systems, It uses the jargon of HSS, or Health System Strengthening. This HSS approach tends to be limited in the sense that the systems involved tend to be directly organized around the three big diseases. For example, the delivery systems for antiretrovirals or the delivery systems for bed nets. And this tends to displace governments and more general health system strengthening. Now, when Paul Farmer talks about the 4 S's of staff, stuff, space, and systems, you can think of the Global Fund tending to privilege the biomedical stuff over the other 3 S's of staff, space, and systems. Its focus on AIDS, TB, and malaria also, of course, marginalizes other diseases, and its approach overall has tended to marginalize national governments and the World Health Organization and the World Health Assembly. You need to keep all of this in mind as you make your mock proposal to the fund. It is important to make the case that what you're going to be investing in will produce measurable results that will have measurable indicators of the rollout of the programming. And all of this involves setting targets. And those are oftentimes expected to be spatially delimited geographical targets on the ground, where you prioritize particular areas for investment in the country because they are seen as the low-hanging fruit, often the peri-urban slums where you can enroll a lot of people in a program very quickly. In other words, there's a lot of selectivity involved, and none of the universality imagined at Alma-Ata. But nevertheless, the Global Fund strategy documents do testify to an awareness at the fund by leaders in Geneva that there's a need to do more than just tackle the big 3 diseases. And so you see diamond diagrams like this one, underlining the need for building resilient and sustainable systems for health, addressing gender equality also, and human rights. Clearly, all these concerns go back to the fight against inequality that was articulated at Alma-Ata. Likewise, the underlying need to mobilize more resources effectively reworks ideas about a new international economic order that were made at Alma-Ata. So it's not as if the Global Fund is the death of the spirit of Alma-Ata altogether. It's more of a hybrid. But as a hybrid, it's strongly influenced by the huge shifts towards selectivity that I've been charting in this lecture. I want to end today by reminding you of your own selective challenge as you pick a country for your mock proposal. As you do this work on the fund, remember that while this is just a mock exercise for you that will be graded by your instructor or a TA, the stakes for the people in the country that you choose are real, and the people in that country don't have a choice. Also, when you're making your choice, consider countries that you already know about or are studying in other classes. Consider countries for which you've got locally relevant language skills. If you speak Spanish or Portuguese or Tagalog or Hindi, for example, that can be a real asset for you for this work. After this lecture, I hope you see why the work matters, and that you have also got a sense of its contested elements too. Thanks for staying tuned here right to the end.